Michael Thornton was a man who had everything that most people could only dream of. His name was often spoken with admiration in the world of business. Wherever he went, people recognized him as a billionaire who had built a vast empire from scratch. But despite all the glitter of success and wealth, Michael carried something heavy in his heart. For years, his home had become nothing more than a place he visited on rare occasions. His business meetings, international conferences, and expanding companies had taken him far away from the quiet mansion where his family lived. It was not that he didn't love them. In fact, his son Daniel was his greatest pride, the reason he had once dreamed of building such a powerful empire. But the years had flown by quickly. What started as a few short trips turned into months away. Those months slowly stretched into years. He told himself every time that it was necessary, that he was securing his family's future, that Daniel would grow up never having to struggle the way he once did. Yet deep down, Michael knew he was also running away from the very things money could not buy: time, presence, and connection. One chilly morning, as his private jet touched down on the runway of his home country, Michael felt a strange excitement he had not felt in years. He had told no one about his arrival. Not his managers, not his assistants, not even his wife. He wanted to surprise them. He wanted, for once, to see life in his home as it truly was, without anyone preparing for his presence. In his mind, he pictured the joy on Daniel's face when he would see his father suddenly walk through the door. That picture gave him a rare warmth, something no business victory ever provided. The drive from the airport to his estate was long, but Michael didn't mind. He stared out of the tinted windows as familiar streets rolled past. Memories of his younger days came back, the days before wealth had swallowed his entire schedule. He remembered when he was just a boy, walking those same streets with nothing but hope in his pockets. And now, here he was, returning as a billionaire. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something essential was missing. When the car finally pulled up at the tall iron gates of his mansion, Michael instructed the driver to wait outside. He wanted to walk in alone. His footsteps echoed softly against the stone pathway as he pushed open the smaller side gate and entered quietly. The mansion stood tall and proud, a symbol of his success, with its polished windows and sprawling garden. But to Michael, it looked a little too quiet. There was no grand welcome, no rushing footsteps of staff, no eager anticipation. And for once, that was exactly how he wanted it. As he walked around the back of the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of his son through the windows, he heard laughter. Soft, cheerful, and full of innocence. His heart skipped. That had to be Daniel. Slowly, he moved closer, his shoes brushing against the trimmed grass. Then, turning the corner, he saw a sight that made him stop in his tracks. There, in the garden, was Daniel. The boy was running across the lawn, his small hands reaching out with excitement. He looked healthier, taller, and older than Michael remembered. The child's laughter rang through the air, pure and beautiful. But what made Michael freeze was not just his son's presence, it was who was with him. A woman stood there, bent slightly forward as she chased after Daniel. She was not family, not someone Michael remembered being close to them. She was dressed in a maid's uniform, her hair tied neatly back, her eyes shining with kindness as she scooped Daniel up into her arms. The boy laughed even louder as she lifted him, and then wrapped his tiny arms around her neck as though she was someone he trusted deeply, someone he loved. Michael's chest tightened. He stayed hidden behind a tall hedge, watching silently. His mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? Why was his son holding her with such closeness? Why did Daniel look at her with the kind of affection that should have been reserved for a parent? For a moment, the great billionaire who could command boardrooms and control markets felt utterly powerless. He had imagined his son running into his arms the moment he returned, but instead, he was watching the boy cling to someone else, someone who was not him. The scene was innocent, yet it pierced his heart. For years he had been gone, and in those years, his son had found comfort in another pair of arms. Michael's steps faltered as emotions rose inside him: surprise, confusion, and a sting of regret he had never expected to feel so strongly. He remembered the promises he had once made when Daniel was born. He had sworn to always be there, to protect him, to guide him. But standing there in the quiet garden, Michael realized how deeply his absence had carved a space in his son's life. And that space had been filled, not by him, but by someone else. Still, Michael did not reveal himself. He simply watched. Daniel's face was glowing with happiness, his small hands patting the woman's cheek as though she was more than just a caretaker. She whispered something to him, and Daniel burst out laughing again, the sound echoing like music. For a billionaire who could buy almost anything, Michael realized this laughter was something his money had failed to purchase for himself. As the sun lowered behind the mansion, casting golden light over the garden, Michael's heart grew heavier. He knew he had come home for a surprise, but instead, it was he who was surprised. The world outside saw him as powerful, untouchable, and complete. But in that moment, standing unseen while his son held tightly to another, he understood that he was a stranger in his own home. And that realization shook him more than any business loss ever could. Michael remained still, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The garden, once a silent corner of the estate, now felt alive with his son's cheerful laughter. Daniel's voice echoed like music, warming Michael's heart but also unsettling it. He had imagined this moment so many times during his travels: his son running into his arms, clinging to him, asking about his adventures. Instead, the boy clung tightly to the maid, his small fingers tangled in her uniform as if that embrace was the safest place in the world. Michael's breath grew shallow. The woman, Grace, had no idea he was standing there. She held Daniel with an ease that came only from routine, the kind of closeness that spoke of countless hours spent together. She adjusted him on her hip as if she had done it thousands of times before, brushing his hair away from his forehead and smiling as though nothing in the world mattered more than his happiness. For a man like Michael, who had sat at tables with world leaders and signed billion-dollar contracts, it was strange to feel so powerless. His authority meant nothing here. He was a father, yet he stood hidden, watching another person carry the role he had once promised to cherish. Daniel pointed toward a flower bed filled with bright tulips, his little voice rising with excitement. Grace followed his gaze, nodding warmly. "You like those, don't you?" she said softly, though Michael couldn't hear every word. She lowered him to the ground, and the boy darted toward the flowers, giggling as he tried to pluck one. Grace quickly stopped him, gently explaining that flowers were meant to be admired, not destroyed. Daniel listened, though not without pouting first, and then he leaned into her side again as though he trusted her every word. Michael's chest tightened further. His son listened to her. His son leaned on her. His son shared moments of joy with her, the very moments Michael had missed while chasing boardroom victories across oceans. For a brief second, he considered stepping out, announcing his arrival with authority, reclaiming his place as the father. He imagined Daniel's surprised face, the rush of recognition, perhaps even tears of joy. But doubt quickly clouded that vision. What if the boy hesitated? What if the child no longer recognized him as the father he was supposed to be? The thought was unbearable. Instead, Michael sank back slightly, keeping himself hidden. The longer he watched, the more unsettled he felt. The way Grace's hand rested protectively on Daniel's shoulder, the way the child's eyes sparkled when he looked at her, it all gnawed at Michael's heart. He had never expected this, never prepared himself for such a sight. The memory of his wife crossed his mind. Where was she? Shouldn't she be the one out here, guiding Daniel, holding his hand, teaching him small lessons about the world? Why had this responsibility fallen so naturally to the maid? Questions tumbled through his mind, each one heavier than the last. A sudden chill passed through him, not from the weather but from a creeping fear. Had his absence created a void so large that his family had quietly moved on without him? Had Grace stepped into a role that was meant for him and his wife, filling the emptiness his long journeys had left behind? The sound of Daniel's laughter pulled him back. The boy was now sitting on the grass, clapping his hands as Grace showed him how to weave small daisy chains. Michael's throat tightened as he realized he had no idea his son liked such simple games. He had bought him expensive toys, gadgets, and clothes during his trips abroad, but it was this simple act of sitting in the grass with a trusted companion that brought Daniel the most joy. Michael turned his face away for a moment, closing his eyes as guilt washed over him. He had thought money could replace presence. He had convinced himself that every absence was justified by the empire he was building for Daniel's future. But the truth, painfully clear before him, was that his son needed him in the present more than in some faraway future. The more he watched, the heavier his heart became. Yet curiosity and longing kept him rooted to the spot. Daniel leaned against Grace as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, his small head resting on her shoulder. She whispered something to him, and his face relaxed, the kind of peaceful expression a child wears only when he feels completely safe. Michael had never felt so much like an outsider in his own home. He was supposed to be the anchor in Daniel's life, the guiding hand and comforting presence. But standing there in silence, he realized that someone else had been that anchor in his absence. He clenched his fists, not out of anger at Grace, but out of frustration with himself. How had he let it come to this? How had he allowed distance to steal the very bond that should have been unbreakable? He had built a fortress of wealth around his family, yet the walls had only separated him from the people who mattered most. The sky darkened slowly, and Michael knew he could not stand there forever. Soon, someone would notice his presence. But still, he hesitated. His heart yearned to rush forward, to scoop Daniel into his arms, to thank Grace for her care. Yet his mind was clouded with fear that the moment might not be as he imagined, fear that his son might not respond the way he longed for. At last, Grace lifted Daniel once more, carrying him toward the house. The boy's eyelids were drooping, his energy fading after the long play. She balanced him carefully, her expression tender and calm. Michael's eyes followed them until they disappeared through the back door. Alone in the garden, silence surrounded him again. But the silence inside him was far louder. It was filled with doubts, regrets, and questions that demanded answers. What had happened during all the years he was gone? How close had Grace grown to his son? And most importantly, what did his son truly feel for him now? As Michael finally turned toward the front of the mansion, preparing to announce his return, his steps were heavy. The billionaire who had returned home unannounced had not expected this. He had not expected his first sight to be his son in another's arms. And though nothing seemed wrong on the surface, the weight of what he had seen lingered deeply in his heart. For the first time in a very long while, Michael Thornton realized that not all surprises bring joy. Some bring questions that shake the soul. And those questions were only just beginning. Michael entered the mansion quietly, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. The place looked just as he remembered: grand chandeliers, polished floors, walls decorated with paintings worth millions. Yet despite all its beauty, it felt strangely empty. Wealth had filled the house with everything except warmth. For the first time, Michael noticed the silence, and it unsettled him. As he walked deeper into the hall, he wondered where his wife was. Surely, she must know where Daniel was spending his time. The memory of the maid holding his son so closely replayed in his mind again and again. Each time he thought of it, he felt a mix of emotions: confusion, curiosity, and a sharp sting of jealousy he didn't want to admit. He sat down on the edge of a sofa in the living room, his hands clasped together tightly. His mind would not stop racing. Was he overthinking what he saw in the garden? Perhaps it was only natural for a child to be fond of someone who cared for him daily. Yet, something about the way Daniel had held Grace so tightly, so naturally made Michael uneasy. The hours of his absence stretched before him like a long road. He had been gone so much that he barely knew his son's daily routines. Did Daniel even remember him clearly? Would he recognize him as his father the moment he appeared? Or would he hesitate, searching his young memory for a man who only appeared in photographs and rare visits? Michael rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of these thoughts. The billionaire who commanded respect from thousands of employees suddenly felt unsure in his own home. He was no longer the man in control. Here, his power meant nothing. Just then, he heard footsteps. His wife, Catherine, appeared from one of the hallways, looking tired but graceful. She stopped in shock when she saw him. "Michael," she whispered, as if unsure whether she was imagining him. He stood up, forcing a smile. "Yes. I'm home." Catherine's face lit up with surprise, though not without a trace of unease. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "That was the point," Michael said, trying to sound light. "I wanted to surprise you." Surprise Daniel. At the mention of his son, his voice softened. Catherine nodded slowly, her eyes studying him carefully. She walked closer, but there was something cautious in her steps. "You should have told me," she said gently. "Things have been different here." Michael's heart skipped. "Different? How?" Before she could answer, the faint sound of Daniel's laughter drifted from upstairs. Grace's voice followed, calm and soothing as she tried to settle the boy down for the evening. Michael's stomach tightened. That sound, his son's laughter mixed with the maid's voice, only deepened his sense of being an outsider. "Is he close to her?" Michael asked suddenly, his tone sharper than he intended. Catherine looked at him, her lips pressing together. "Grace has been here every day. You know how often you've been away, Michael. She has cared for Daniel when I was busy, when I couldn't be everywhere at once. Yes, he is close to her. Very close." Michael's chest tightened. He sat back down, staring at the floor. He had expected his wife to reassure him, to tell him that nothing had changed, that his son still looked up to him as the only father figure. Instead, her words felt like confirmation of his fears. "I saw them in the garden," he admitted quietly. "Daniel looked happy. Happier than I have ever seen him. And he was with her, not me." Catherine sighed, sitting opposite him. "What did you expect? You've missed so many birthdays, so many milestones. Daniel needed someone to laugh with, someone to comfort him when he cried at night. Grace was there when you weren't. That doesn't mean he doesn't love you, Michael. But children remember who is present." Her words pierced him more deeply than he cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to remind her of the sacrifices he had made to give them everything they had. But as he opened his mouth, the truth silenced him. Catherine was right. He had been absent far too often. He had chosen boardrooms over bedtime stories, contracts over family dinners. And now, he was paying the price. Still, doubt crept in. A darker thought whispered through his mind: was Grace more than just a caretaker in his son's eyes? Could she have taken his place in ways he hadn't imagined? The thought unsettled him deeply. What if Daniel sees her as his mother? Michael asked suddenly, his voice filled with unease. Catherine's expression softened. "She isn't his mother, Michael. I am. But I won't deny she has been a second mother to him in many ways. He trusts her. He loves her. And honestly, I don't blame him." Michael leaned back, closing his eyes. The words second mother echoed in his head. It was not betrayal, but it felt like one. It was as if the space he had left open in Daniel's life had been quietly filled, and now there was little room for him to fit back in. That night, he lay awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling. He could hear faint sounds from down the hall, Grace's soft humming as she finally got Daniel to sleep. He imagined his son curled up peacefully, held by someone who was not him. The image tormented him. He rolled over, trying to convince himself he was imagining the worst. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how distant he had become. He didn't know what Daniel's favorite game was. He didn't know which story calmed him at night or which toy made him laugh the loudest. Grace knew. She had been there. The doubts gnawed at him, refusing to fade. He began to wonder about Grace herself. Who was she, beyond the uniform she wore? Why had she given so much of herself to his child? Was it only duty, or something deeper? And if Daniel had grown so attached, what did that mean for his place as a father? The night stretched on, and sleep refused to come. Michael realized with a sinking heart that his battle was not with Grace, nor even with Catherine. His battle was with himself, with the choices he had made, with the years he had given to wealth instead of love. And though he did not admit it aloud, a painful question lingered in his mind: had he already lost the role he was meant to play in his son's life? The next morning, Michael woke early, though he had barely slept at all. He sat by the window in his bedroom, looking out at the garden where he had seen Daniel and Grace the day before. The sight had haunted him through the night. No matter how hard he tried to silence his thoughts, the image of his son in her arms returned again and again. The house was slowly coming to life. He could hear faint movements in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the soft murmur of voices. Somewhere down the hallway, Daniel's laughter rang out once more, followed by Grace's calm and steady tone. Michael's chest tightened. He had wanted to surprise his son with his return, but now he hesitated. What if Daniel's first reaction wasn't joy? What if the boy ran past him and into Grace's arms instead? The thought was painful, but Michael knew he couldn't keep hiding. He needed to understand. He needed to face the truth, no matter how hard it might be. As he walked down the hallway, he paused outside Daniel's room. The door was half open, and he could see inside. Grace was sitting on the edge of the bed, helping Daniel with his shirt. She moved patiently, her hands careful as she buttoned it up. Daniel's small voice chattered happily, and she listened as if every word was important. When the boy noticed something was uneven in the collar, Grace smiled and fixed it with care. Then she leaned back, brushing Daniel's hair with her hand. "There," she said softly. "You're ready." Michael's throat grew tight. That should have been him. Those small moments of care, those little gestures of love, they were the very things he had missed. Finally, he stepped inside. "Daniel." The boy froze, blinking in surprise. Grace turned too, her eyes widening when she saw Michael. For a second, silence filled the room. "Daddy." Daniel's voice was uncertain at first, as though testing the word. Then his face lit up. "Daddy." The boy jumped off the bed and ran to him. Relief swept over Michael as Daniel threw his arms around his legs. He bent down, pulling his son into a hug, holding him tightly. Tears threatened to rise in his eyes, but he kept them back. For this moment, he was grateful. His son still remembered him, still recognized him. But even as joy filled him, Michael noticed the way Daniel turned his head slightly, as if making sure Grace was still there. She gave him a reassuring nod, and only then did Daniel relax fully in Michael's arms. Michael's heart ached at that small detail. Even in this reunion, Grace's presence was what gave his son security. Later that day, Michael asked Catherine if they could talk. They sat in the study, the heavy wooden desk between them. Michael didn't waste time. "Tell me everything about Grace," he said quietly. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You saw it yourself, Michael. She has been more than a maid here. She has been family." Michael frowned. "Family? She works for us. She has done much more than work, Catherine replied firmly. When Daniel fell ill last winter, I was terrified. You were away in Europe. The doctors came, but it was Grace who sat by his side night after night, refusing to leave him. When I was overwhelmed with responsibilities, she took Daniel to school, played with him, made sure he never felt alone. She has loved him as though he were her own. Michael's mind replayed her words. He remembered the countless times he had been absent, the missed birthdays, the missed firsts. Grace had been there in his place, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Still, his pride resisted. But Catherine, don't you think this closeness is too much? Daniel depends on her more than he does on us. Catherine's expression softened. That isn't her fault, Michael. It is ours. We left a space in his heart, and she filled it with kindness. You should not see her as a rival. You should see her as someone who saved us from losing our son's trust completely. Michael leaned back, his chest heavy with guilt. He had wanted to blame Grace, but the truth was clear, she had not taken his place, he had given it up. And she had simply stepped in, out of love. That afternoon, Michael finally spoke with Grace alone. He found her in the kitchen, preparing Daniel's favorite snack. She looked nervous when he entered, unsure of how he might react. "Mr. Thornton," she said softly, bowing her head. "Grace," Michael began, his voice firm but not unkind, "I saw how close you are with my son. I need to know, why? Why do you care for him so deeply?" Grace looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "Because he needed it, sir. A child should never feel alone. Daniel is a sweet boy. He missed you every night, even when he was too young to understand why you weren't here. He cried for you. And when I saw that, I couldn't stand back. I cared for him the way I hoped someone would care for my own child if I wasn't there." Her words were simple, but they struck Michael with force. There was no hidden motive, no selfish reason. Only pure kindness. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "You have done what I should have done. For that, I owe you more than I can say." Grace shook her head. "You don't owe me, sir. All Daniel really wants is you. He talks about you every day. He shows me the pictures of you in the house and asks when you will come back. He loves you, Mr. Thornton. He only needed someone to hold him until you returned." Michael's chest swelled with both pain and hope. Pain for the years he had lost, but hope that his son still longed for him, still saw him as his father. That evening, when he tucked Daniel into bed for the first time in years, the boy smiled sleepily. "Daddy, will you stay this time?" The question pierced Michael's heart. He brushed his son's hair gently and whispered, "Yes, Daniel. I will stay. I promise." As Daniel's eyes closed and his breathing slowed, Michael sat beside the bed for a long while. Grace's words echoed in his mind. Catherine's honesty weighed on him. And his son's innocent trust reminded him of the responsibility he could no longer run from. For the first time in a long time, Michael understood the truth. Wealth had made him powerful in the world's eyes, but it had also made him blind to what truly mattered. Grace had not stolen his son's love. She had protected it, preserved it, and handed it back to him when he returned. And in that quiet room, Michael made a silent vow. He would no longer be the absent father who relied on others to raise his child. He would learn to be present, to rebuild the bond he had nearly lost. And he would forever be grateful to the woman who had kept his son's heart whole in his absence. The days that followed were unlike anything Michael had experienced in years. For the first time in a long while, he set aside his phone, his meetings, and the endless demands of his empire. Instead, he chose to wake up early and join Daniel for breakfast. At first, his son seemed shy, as though not sure how to act with his father suddenly home. But slowly, day by day, the distance between them began to close. Michael walked Daniel to school, holding his little hand firmly as they crossed the driveway. He listened as the boy spoke about his teachers, his favorite games, and even the small things he enjoyed, like chocolate milk or the swing set in the park. These were details Michael had never known before, details Grace and Catherine had carried in his absence. Each time Daniel shared something new, Michael realized just how much he had missed. But instead of drowning in regret, he made a decision. He would not waste time grieving over lost years. He would use the time ahead to rebuild what he had neglected. Grace remained close by, still caring for Daniel with the same devotion as before. At first, Michael felt a sting each time he saw Daniel rush to her with excitement or lean on her shoulder when he was tired. But now, instead of jealousy, he felt gratitude. He began to see Grace not as a rival, but as a blessing. She had been the bridge that kept Daniel from feeling abandoned. Without her, his son might have grown distant and cold. One evening, after dinner, Michael invited Grace to sit with him in the living room. She seemed hesitant at first, unused to such attention from her employer. But he spoke with sincerity. "Grace," he said, his voice gentle, "I have watched you these last few days. I see the way Daniel trusts you. I see the love you give him, the patience you show. I want to thank you. Not just as your employer, but as a father. You gave my son something I couldn't, and I will never forget that." Grace lowered her eyes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I only did what felt right, sir. Daniel is a special boy. He deserves love and attention. I only gave him what he needed." Michael nodded slowly. "And for that, I am forever grateful. From now on, you are not just an employee here. You are part of this family. You will always have a place with us." Her eyes welled up with tears at his words. She bowed her head, too moved to respond. From that day, things began to shift. The household grew warmer. Catherine seemed more at peace, relieved to see Michael finally taking his place as a present husband and father. Grace continued to care for Daniel, but now with Michael at her side. The boy no longer looked between them for reassurance. He began to feel secure, knowing his father was finally there. One Saturday afternoon, Michael took Daniel to the park. They played together on the swings, raced on the grass, and shared ice cream under the shade of a large tree. At one point, Daniel looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, will you leave again?" The question struck Michael deeply. He crouched down, meeting his son's gaze. "No, Daniel. I won't leave you like before. I promise you, I will be here. I will be with you, every step as you grow." Daniel smiled and wrapped his arms around his neck. That embrace was worth more to Michael than any contract he had ever signed. Over time, Michael began to reflect on his choices. He realized that success meant little without the people you loved to share it with. All his wealth, his power, his reputation, it could never replace the bond of family. For years, he had believed he was securing his son's future by building an empire. But the truth was that the most valuable gift he could give Daniel was his time, his presence, and his love. Grace's role in this story was not forgotten. In fact, Michael made sure her kindness was honored. He increased her salary, but more importantly, he treated her with respect. He encouraged Daniel to continue seeing her as someone important, someone who would always have a place in their lives. She had become more than a maid. She was family, a symbol of loyalty and love. One evening, as Michael sat with Catherine by the fireplace, he spoke softly. "I almost lost everything that mattered. Not because I was poor, but because I was too busy being rich. Thank you for keeping our home together while I was gone. Thank you for trusting Grace to care for Daniel. Without both of you, I don't know what kind of father I would have returned to be." Catherine reached for his hand, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "It's not too late, Michael. What matters is that you're here now. What matters is that you've learned. Her words gave him comfort. From that day on, Michael made sure his calendar looked different. He still worked, but never at the cost of missing dinner with his family. He still traveled, but never without making sure Daniel felt secure in his return. Business was important, but no longer more important than the laughter of his son or the peace of his home. Years later, when Daniel grew old enough to understand, Michael told him the truth. He told him about the years he had been away, about the mistakes he had made, and about the lesson he had learned. Daniel listened quietly, then smiled and said, "But you came back, Daddy. That's what matters." That simple answer stayed with Michael forever. In the end, the billionaire's greatest wealth was not his companies, his houses, or his name. It was the bond he rebuilt with his son, the gratitude he carried for Grace's selfless care, and the renewed love he shared with his wife. He had returned home unannounced, expecting a joyful reunion, but instead he had been confronted with a truth he had long ignored. That truth changed him forever. And from that moment on, he lived not just as a billionaire, but as a father who had learned the true meaning of presence, love, and family.